Thank you for the extremely generous introduction. Let me start. We'll have a look at the literary figure of domestic servants. And this is just a tiny piece of the range of texts and contexts I'm looking at for my wider project. So I'd like to start with the question, what can literary and cultural studies gain from paying more attention to the depiction of domestic servants in 19th century literature and in literature in general? At first, the potential of foregrounding this category of literary figures might seem fairly limited. The number of fictional texts in which domestic servants either appear as main characters or are made memorable in other ways is comparatively small, especially in the 19th century. So when you think of literary figures that are domestic servants, probably, you might think of some, but most of them are actually earlier, from the 18th century or later. So from the 18th century, for instance, of course, Samuel Richardson's Pamela or Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews come to mind. In the 20th century, you have novels such as Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, or Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace. Yet, I'm starting from the assumption that the implications of focusing on domestic servants go beyond analyzing single texts in which they appear as prominent characters. As I hope to show in the following, a reading strategy that seeks to contextualize depictions of domestic service and strives to pay attention to all references to domestic servants, and you will see that I mean that literally, even cursory ones may open up new readings of literary texts. There are, of course, a number of theoretical approaches that have proposed adopting new lenses for reading 19th century literature. There's a long tradition by now of feminist approaches, gender-oriented, a little bit more recently queer and post-colonial approaches, which have shown new facets of 19th century fiction. All of these approaches have provided new insights and have brought forth new interpretations of literary classics. What the approaches I just mentioned have all in common is that they rely on contextualization. So neither of the approaches works without contextualization. In a monograph from 1993 called The Servant's Hand, English Fiction from Below, Bruce Robbins argued that historical contextualization of literary representations of servants is not fruitful, somewhat surprisingly. Robbins claimed that the figure of the servant in English literature has to be understood as a reiteration of literary conventions, which can be traced back to the Restoration, the Renaissance, and even antiquity. When I read this text after I had sort of my project, I was first of all a bit worried whether what I wanted to do works, but I think it does, because I agree with Robbins that the literary figure of the servant in 19th century literature, but also in other centuries, is often informed by literary conventions. So very often we are dealing with characters who follow certain templates, which have been around for a very long time. I still assume that this is no reason to give up attempts to contextualize. And despite the significance of literary conventions, there's much to be gained from changing historical contexts into consideration. So instead of giving up on a historical contextualization of the literary figure of the servant, I propose adopting a method of reading that resembles to some extent the post-colonial reading of literary texts that Edward Said proposed, especially in Culture and Imperialism, interestingly published in the same year as the text by Robbins I just mentioned. In his path-breaking monograph, Orientalism, as you all know, of course, and even more in Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said has demonstrated that new possibilities of understanding the relation between fictional works and the contexts in which they emerge can be shown if we also pay attention to passing references to imperialism in his case, and not only to those works that really foreground colonialism. So Said famously claimed that of course, Robinson Crusoe, of course, texts by Kipling or by Joseph Conrad are interesting, but it's also the tiny details, what is mentioned in passing, that can be very, very informative. What is meant by that becomes apparent in his famous comment on Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park. This novel by Austen features a family whose wealth is based to a large extent on plantations in Antigua, that is, on slave labor. Yet, there are no scenes in the entire novel that are actually set in Antigua or that address the source of the family's wealth openly. What is described is simply the everyday life of the gentry in England, just as in all of Austen's novels. Said now claims that Mansfield Park legitimizes colonialism despite an explicit lack of explicit representation. So, he argues as you can see here, according to Austen, we are to conclude that no matter how isolated and insulated the English place, for example Mansfield Park, it requires overseas sustenance. So even if we don't see that this is important on the surface of the novel, it's still there, and it was there for people at the time who read the text. And I propose that very similar insights can be gained from paying attention to references to domestic servants, even very marginal ones. While this lens does not necessarily mean focusing on complex, fully developed characters, which is, of course, what people in literary studies like to do most of the time, it may still bring even, and it sometimes even brings forth quite frustratingly little information. It still leads to changes in the overall picture of specific texts and subgenres. In other words, I assume that domestic servants are good to think with, as Jean Clack puts it in an article on domestic servants in England from 1660 to 1750. Of course, analysis foregrounding the category class as such are nothing new. There are many of these around. It is striking, however, that most studies focusing on class in 19th century literature show very, very little interest in domestic servants. I say something more about the reasons for that later on. In this respect, research also follows the lead of Victorian social problem novels. While novels such as Charles Dickens's Hard Times or Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester Life and North and South draw attention to the dismal living and working conditions of factory workers and call for social reform, the situation of domestic servants is largely ignored. It seems surprising that the situation of domestic servants remains a blind spot in these and other literary texts from the 19th century, despite the fact that domestic servants constituted a very large segment of the working class population. In particular, working class women and girls very often found employment in domestic service. When child labor was criticized in 19th century literature, the fate of chimney sweepers, think of Blake for instance, and of children working in factories was highlighted. But there were also many children who were employed as domestic servants. It was not until 1880 that compulsory education up to the age of 10, you can imagine 10, was introduced in Britain. Before that, children under the age of 10 could be sent to work by their parents, and very often were sent to work, and often children as young as 8 were already employed as servants. So many of the servants we read about in literature of the time could actually be as young as 8 or 9. And I think it's important to keep this in mind. Servants in general, and children in particular, were paid very little, which often meant homelessness when servants lost their position, for whatever reason. Servants frequently faced sexual harassment, and there's evidence of unwanted pregnancies. It does not even seem possible from today's perspective to determine how big this problem of sexual harassment was at the time, but we definitely know from sources that it did exist. There are several factors which might explain why literary authors typically avoided examining the situation of domestic servants. One important reason is presumably that domestic servants were less visible and audible as a group than, for instance, factory workers, and were thus less perceived as a potential threat, as Edward Higgs points out, who said, quote, "The domestic servant population was vast and distributed in small units throughout the whole country. It created no unions or other expressions of collective discontent, which could have attracted the attention of Parliament or social scientists." So you probably know that in industrial novels from the time, we very often have these scenes where you have factory workers, for instance, in North and South, gathering in front of homes, threatening factory owners, threatening the middle class. There's nothing like that for domestic servants, which contributed to them being not very much noticed at the time. An additional reason, and I think an equally important one, for the widespread neglect of the situation of domestic servants in 19th century novels is presumably that the issues related to domestic servants were quite literally too close to home for writers and readers who belonged to the middle class and thus lived in households that employed servants themselves. So if they wanted to criticize that, they could actually have started in their own home. While we might think of servants primarily as a phenomenon of upper-class households today, it was perfectly normal for middle-class families in Victorian Britain to employ servants, and doing so was even important as a status symbol. You have this, for instance, at the beginning of Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, where the family of the protagonist loses a lot of money, and then they consider how they can make do with less money. And they have to let some of the servants go, but it's absolutely out of the question to have no servants anymore. They have fewer candles, for instance. They eat food that is less expensive, but you need servants, or you didn't belong to the middle class anymore. In the following, I will now first discuss the depiction of domestic servants in Jane Austen's novels to show what even brief references to servants can tell us. Next, I will have a look at some recurring types of servants in Victorian novels. At the end of my presentation, I will briefly address the ways in which domestic service in British households in the past is remembered today, in historical novels as well as in audiovisual media. For instance, in, of course, the internationally successful TV series Downton Abbey, mentioned in my title. If there's still enough time, but we'll see, I could also show you two short excerpts from a report written by an actual domestic servant in the 19th century to show you how huge this gap between literary presentations and actual ego texts is. My exploration of representations of domestic servants, as I mentioned before, is still very much work in progress. And I certainly don't want to claim that Jane Austen's novels are representative of British literature at the beginning of the 19th century. Still, I think Austen's novels are a good place to start, not least because they also continue to shape the way people think today about servants in the past, because we are dealing with literary classics, and we are also dealing with texts that have given rise to a large number of audiovisual adaptations and rewritings. So they are still very much present in the public today. Jane Austen's novels confront readers who pay attention to the depiction of domestic servants with a paradox that is characteristic of many 19th century novels. On the one hand, there are no servants among the main characters. Indeed, it is possible to argue that servants are all but invisible in Austen's work. On the other hand, references to servants can be shown to fulfill a whole range of different functions. In all of her works, Austen focused on the landed gentry, on upper-class families residing in the British countryside. And for this segment of British society, it was perfectly normal to employ servants. Depending on the size of the house, they sometimes had up to 70 servants, if you can imagine. So Downton Abbey would have been a very modest household at the time. Thus, even if there are no specific reference to servants in the text, readers at Austen's time were perfectly aware of the fact that the landed gentry employed servants, as Natalie Walsh points out. Quote, Jane Austen's contemporary readers would have assumed the presence of servants whether she mentioned them or not. They were simply a part of everyday life in the 18th and 19th centuries, so no formal allusion to their presence was ever necessary. Many of Austen's characters, in fact, live in the kind of large houses, as you can see here, in which a substantial number of servants were employed. Netherfield, Pemberley, and Rosings in Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey and Mansfield Park in the eponymous novels, all of these houses require a large domestic staff. Chatsworth House, which you can see here in the Peak District in Derbyshire, did not only serve as a filming location in one of the most famous audiovisual adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, this particular house may even have served as an inspiration for Austen's description of Mr. Darcy's Pemberley. It is not hard to imagine that a large staff was necessary to run a house like Chatsworth. Yet, families like the Bennets in Pride and Prejudice, whose houses were significantly more modest, also had a number of servants. In the course of Pride and Prejudice, a housekeeper, as well as a butler, and further servants employed in Longbourn, the house of the Bennets, are mentioned. None of these servants is individualized at any point in the novel. The butler is mentioned once, very briefly, or turns out to be of particular importance for the plot. Given that servants were an integral part of life in households of the gentry, it should come as no particular surprise that there are many casual references to domestic servants in Austen's novels. Servants are typically only mentioned in passing, though, and more often than not, they remain nameless. The hair was curled and the maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. The sentence from her novel Emma exemplifies what typical references to servants look like in Austen's works. The main function of the sentence is clearly that of evoking an everyday situation, thus contributing to the reality effect, and referring to the mood of the main character, rather than saying anything interesting about the servant. There's not even a hint at any conversation with the maid, something that fans of Downton Abbey would presumably expect at this point. So when the employer is miserable, of course, this is a good opportunity to have a conversation. This is not the case in Austen's novels. Throughout her novels, there are many similar references to servants fulfilling various tasks around the house without any attempt at fleshing out these characters. In the other passages you can see here from Northanger Abbey, for instance, it is clearly the arrival of the refreshments rather than the person carrying the tray that is important. At the same time, that a tray of refreshments was introduced by his servant. The lack of individualization in references to servants is presumably most obvious in passive constructions like the following ones, which presuppose the presence of servants without even making them visible on the syntactic level. Till coffee came in, the carriage was soon announced to be ready, and there are many, many more like these in her novels. In an article from 2020, Marie Hockenhull-Smith characterizes the representation of domestic servants in Austen's novels as follows, quote, "With a few exceptions, Austen does not give servants a distinctive character. Though she may acknowledge the material fact of the labor they do, she rarely brings them forward as individuals." And passages like these certainly support this impression. The functions of references to servants, however, are not limited to contributing to the reality effect. Servants are also mentioned in contexts where they provide further information on their employers, both with regard to social status and character traits. A character's social status is often indicated by the number of servants employed in their household, as well as by the types of servants and their qualifications. For the Coles in Emma, who are described as being, quote, "of low origin in trade and only moderately genteel," social mobility translates into owning a larger house and employing more servants. They added to their house, to their number of servants, to their expenses of every sort. Syntactically, references to servants as status symbols are often included in enumerations, which arguably puts the servants on the same level as houses and other types of alienable possession, as the following examples from Pride and Prejudice illustrate. The sight of such rooms, so many servants, and so splendid a dinner. They were all the servants and all the articles of plate which Mr. Collins had promised, or her thoughts and her words ran wholly on those attendants of elegant nuptials, fine muslins, new carriages, and servants. Often offering information on the status of characters is one of the three principal functions of servants in Austen's novels identified by Walsh. According to Walsh, the other two main functions are providing character references and driving the plot as effectively as the key players. These two functions are sometimes linked, as you will see. Even though not individualized themselves, servants often turn out to play a vital role in the context of the explicit and implicit characterization techniques throughout Austen's novels. A case in point is the famous characterization of Mr. Darcy by his housekeeper, which makes Elizabeth Bennet wonder whether she might have misjudged Mr. Darcy. The housekeeper famously declares, "I've never had a cross word from him in my life, and I've known him ever since he was 4 years old." Elizabeth considers this comment important for assessing Mr. Darcy's character, reasoning, what praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? Elizabeth's uncle, Mr. Gardiner, however, is a good deal more skeptical. He argues, "He's a liberal master, I suppose, and that, in the eye of a servant, comprehends every virtue." Implicitly, Mr. Gardiner questions whether servants are really the reliable judges of their employer's character, instead of being simply guided by their own interests. In a similar vein, Mr. Bennet later on warns his eldest daughter Jane, when she's about to get married, quote, "You are each of you so complying that nothing will ever be resolved, so easy that every servant will cheat on you." In this statement, prejudices come into play, specifically the idea that servants are likely to take advantage of their employers, provided they're given the opportunity of doing so. And this is a very prominent motif in the 19th century, also beyond Austen's novels. References to servants may not only play an important role among the techniques of explicit characterization, they may also prove effective as tools of implicit characterization. In the case of Mrs. Elton in Emma, the information that she cannot even remember her own servants' names, combined with the fact that she repeatedly finds fault with other character servants, complete the overall negative image readers are likely to form of this character. In Sense and Sensibility, Fanny Dashwood's greed is stressed when she complains about the expenses caused by voluntary pensions for former servants implemented by her father in his will. And this is a passage that's very interesting for my project. She says, "My mother was clocked with the payment of 3 annuities to old superannuated servants by my father's will, and it is amazing how disagreeable she found it. Twice every year these annuities were to be paid, and then there was the trouble of getting it to them, and then one of them was said to have died, and afterwards it turned out to be no such thing. My mother was quite sick of it." Here we have a very, very affluent character complaining about money paid to former servants. In a society where servants were likely to become destitute in old age, unless relatives or their former employers were willing to support them, Fanny's attitude is indicative of the egocentric stance this character displays in general. And this is one of the interesting passages where you, in a short comment, get a sense of the actual situation of servants at the time. There are 2 characters who stand out in Austen's novels due to apparently displaying a strong interest in the situation and even the well-being of servants. One of these characters is Mr. Woodhouse, the father of the title character in Emma. Kindly Mr. Woodhouse is, for instance, shown to worry whether his coachman, as you can see here, will like to take out the carriage to drive his daughter to the house of friends. He exclaims, "The carriage, but James will not like to put the horses to for such little way, And where are the horses, the poor horses, to be while we are paying our visit? Judith Terry reads Mr. Woodhouse's concern for a servant's views as a tribute to the importance of the coachman. But it seems somewhat doubtful whether this is really the main function of this passage. After all, the assumption that a coachman is going to dislike putting the horses to for such a little way seems somewhat unlikely. Moreover, the potential soundness of Mr. Woodhouse's surprising deference to his servants' interests is undermined by his clearly far-fetched worries about where the horses could stay during a visit at their friend's house, which he utters in the same breath. Thus, instead of expressing a genuine interest in a servant's perspective, Mr. Woodhouse's worries ultimately serve to support his overall characterization as a man who is preoccupied with worries that prove unfounded and may even border on the ridiculous. So, not every instance of showing compassion with a servant, showing interest in a servant, is necessarily shown in a very positive light in these novels. The other character who appears to be particularly interested in his servants is General Tilney, the owner of Northanger Abbey in the eponymous novel. Unlike Emma's father, General Tilney is presented as a very arrogant and unpleasant character throughout the novel. He, for instance, objects to his children marrying purely for love, and he throws the protagonist, Catherine Morland, out of his house when he finds out that she, contrary to what he had assumed, is no rich heiress. It may initially come as a surprise that this cold-hearted character has introduced, quote, every modern invention to facilitate the labor of the cook, as well as accommodations and comforts by which the labors of her inferiors were softened. This apparent paradox allows the conclusion that General Tilney is presumably more interested in the modernization of his estate than in the comfort of his servants. As the examples of Mr. Woodhouse and General Tilney have shown, what seems like expressions of interest in servants may turn out to have a quite different meaning. What is particularly interesting for an analysis of the depiction of domestic servants in Austen's novels are those comparatively rare moments when a certain amount of friction between servants and their employers becomes visible. Mr. Bennet's comment on the servants being likely to take advantage of his daughter Jane, which I mentioned earlier, falls into this category. A novel that is especially intriguing with respect to friction between servants and their employers, however, is Mansfield Park. When protagonist Fanny Price returns to her parents' home after having lived for many years with her rich relatives, the servant opening the door of her parents' house is described as a trollopy-looking maidservant. This negative first impression, expressed in a formulation that is quite untypical of Austen's general very elegant style, is confirmed by the overall demeanor of the servants and by how they are shown to perform their tasks in the Price household, which appears to be, frankly, a mess. The food prepared by the servants is bad. There are half-cleaned plates and not half-cleaned knives and forks. The maxim that servants should ideally not be seen, let alone heard, is clearly not working in this household at all. The servants openly show a lack of respect for their employers and are repeatedly referred to as being loud. Quote, whatever was wanted was hallooed for, and the servants hallooed out their excuses from the kitchen. The text suggests that this situation is caused by the incompetence of the servants as well as by the incompetence of Mrs. Price. The heterodiegetic narrator characterizes her as, quote, dissatisfied with her servants without skill to make them better, and whether helping or reprimanding or indulging them without any power of engaging their respect. While readers might perhaps be inclined to sympathize with Mrs. Price to some extent, there are also comments which, at least for modern readers, might raise the question whether her expectations go too far in some respects. The readers are informed that Mrs. Price is terribly annoyed when she sees her servant Rebecca on Sundays passing by with a flower in her hat. Why is this habit of decorating her hat with a flower so annoying? It might be seen as expressing a certain amount of agency on the part of the servant, but hardly more than she displays when she refuses to do her work in the way her employer wants her to. Thus, we can conclude that the flower in her hat should probably be read in a different way, namely as an allusion to Rebecca's attempts to gain the attention of possible suitors. In other words, Mrs. Price does not want her servant to enter a romantic relationship. In various Victorian novels, there are also references to employers, and sometimes more explicit references to employers, trying to prevent their servants from having romantic relationships. In Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, for instance, Miss Mattie, who is otherwise presented as a very kind-hearted person, does her utmost to prevent her maidservant from having any male visitors, as she calls them. For servants who lived in their employers' households, this restriction meant that they were prevented from love relationships, possibly also from forming a family or from leaving the household for the sake of preserving their employer's reputation. Having romantic relationships was not the only way in which servants could endanger their employer's reputation, however. A much more common concern was that servants knew too much about the people who employed them. There are many references to characters avoiding particular topics when servants are present or ceasing to talk altogether when servants enter the room. For example, in Mansfield Park, the appearance of a housemaid prevented any further conversation. The lack of privacy is a huge issue in the relationship between servants and their employers. In Mansfield Park, the scandalous piece of news that one of the Bertram's daughters has left her husband to elope with another man is spread by a servant who had exposure in her power and, supported by her mistress, was not to be silenced. Generally, servants are suspected in Austen's novels of being keen on talking about their employers and spreading gossip, which can also be read as indicative of a certain antagonism between employers and servants. Sometimes, servants are even responsible for spoiling their employer's plans. In Sense and Sensibility, for instance, Colonel Brandon recalls having been prevented from eloping to Scotland with the woman he loved by the treachery or the folly of the latter's maid. This antagonism, which can be traced in Austen's novels, becomes much more prominent in many Victorian novels. In the middle of the 19th century, in novels by authors such as Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell, servants by and large continue to be minor characters. Mid-Victorian novels address a wide range of social problems, including the precarious situation of governesses, the plight of factory workers, the marginalization of so-called fallen women, and the hardships of life in the workhouse. By contrast, ladies' maids, maids of all work, footmen, butlers, and other people employed in private households continue to play decidedly marginal roles. Still, in comparison to Austen's novels, servants become at least somewhat more visible and more individualized. This can be explained, among other things, by the fact that middle-class households are increasingly the focus of interest. In these households, servants were also part of everyday life in the 19th century, but they were employed in far smaller numbers than in the upper-class households in Austen's novels, and privacy was even more of a problem because the houses were smaller and you lived much closer together. Employing servants, as I mentioned before, was an important status symbol for middle-class families. Yet some middle-class families did not want to or could not spend much money on servants. This led to a phenomenon that is rarely mentioned in literary texts, but it occurs occasionally, namely the large number of girls recruited from the workhouse, who were paid little, if anything. These young female servants found themselves in extremely precarious and dependent situations. Since they typically had little education or training, they were dependent on the goodwill of their employers. Charles Dickens's David Copperfield refers to the practice of hiring girls from the workhouse. In this text, it is the nearly destitute Micawber family who can only afford having a servant girl from the workhouse. who is nicknamed the Orpheling. So this overlaps with the motif of the orphan character, and who essentially shares the poverty of the family she works for. This is the kind of reference to the situation of a servant that cannot be accounted for by literary conventions alone, since it picks up an actual social problem of the time. The figure of the Orpheling is also a particularly striking reminder of the fact that domestic servants in 19th century Britain should not be thought of as a homogeneous group. Instead, their position and their income differed very much, ranging from the fairly good position of a housekeeper or a butler to the oftentimes precarious situation of the maid-of-all-work. Upon closer inspection, there are quite a number of intriguing servants in Victorian novels. This list includes Molly, Mr. Jagger's servant in Great Expectations by Dickens, who was saved from the gallows by her employer and is now dependent on his goodwill. Or, in Jane Eyre, we have Grace Poole, who is essentially a jailer for Mr. Rochester's wife in this novel, and can also be read, interestingly, as a parody of that usually most elegant type of female servant, the lady's maid. Of course, these literary servant figures are not among the main characters of the texts. They do not say much, they don't have many lines, and they do not appear very often in the text. This does not mean, however, that we should dismiss characters like these as uninteresting. Choosing a new lens for reading literature may render characters interesting who might otherwise easily be ignored. The perhaps most striking example of moving in a character who is in purely textual terms definitely marginal, center stage, can also be found in Jane Eyre. As the academic reception of this novel and the popular reception of this novel has shown. Mr. Rochester's supposedly mentally ill wife, who is imprisoned in the attic of Thornfield Hall, does not utter a single word in the entire novel. She laughs, but she doesn't say a word, and she appears only in very few scenes. Nevertheless, she has become an extremely visible literary figure and has been discussed in numerous academic publications ever since having been discovered by feminist and post-colonial scholars and writers in the late 1970s and 1980s. And here, of course, Gilbert and Gubar's The Mad Woman in the Attic, which also derives the title from this character, contributed very much. Many domestic servants in Victorian novels are inconspicuous, largely invisible, marginal figures who go about their activities and are of no further consequence beyond that. This type of figure continues patterns as well as functions that can already be observed in Austen's novels. Yet even servants who are not individualized can serve to highlight social problems of the time and class conflicts that become prominent in Victorian novels. Cases in point include the literary portrayals of the relationship between governesses and servants in novels like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey. Both novels include explicit criticism of the way governesses were treated at the time. This is achieved on the one hand by depicting snobbish upper-class characters who treat governesses badly, and on the other hand by servants who likewise fail to show respect. This is at least what the situation looks like from the perspective of the governess, who doubles as protagonist and narrator. Due to the choice of narrator, readers are likely to share the governess's anger at not being treated with more respect by the servants, as the following passage from Agnes Grey expresses. Quote, "The servants, seeing in what little estimation the governess was held by both parents and children, regulated their behavior by the same standard. I have frequently stood up for them, at the risk of some injury to myself, against the tyranny and injustice of their young masters and mistresses. And I always endeavored to give them as little trouble as possible, but they entirely neglected my comfort, despised my requests, and slighted my directions. All servants, I am convinced, would not have done so, but the domestics in general, being ignorant and little accustomed to reason and reflection, are too easily corrupted by the carelessness and bad example of those above them. And these, I think, were not of the best order to begin with. While the governess who is talking in this passage claims that she has acted in the servants' best interest, the way she refers to them sounds hardly very respectful. Her position is clearly informed by middle-class prejudices and by the goal of maintaining a distance to the working class. Reading passages like this against the grain, from the servant's perspective, might highlight the middle-class bias which is characteristic of Victorian novels in general. And with this passage, or with the novel in Agnes Grey in general, I read that very often with classes, and the groups always agreed that it's really insolent how the servants behave. They should show more respect, so they immediately adopt the perspective of the governess. If you know a bit more about the situation of servants at the time, and think that maybe some of the servants are very young people in a very precarious situation, I think our assessment can change to some extent. A recurring type of servant in Victorian novels are those who function primarily as confidants of a more prominent character. Examples of this type include Rachel in Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Dixon in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. The main characteristic of this type of servant is their absolute loyalty to their employers. Basically, they appear to have no interests or even no life of their own. They consistently prioritize their employer's interests and well-being. This is a type of character that indeed appears to be informed primarily by maybe wishful thinking and definitely by literary conventions by those servants who act as confidants, for instance, in countless Restoration comedies. Somewhat surprisingly, the servant as confident is not necessarily presented in entirely positive terms in Victorian novels. Even though the loyalty to their female employers that is invariably displayed by Dixon and Rachel is beyond doubt, they are nevertheless portrayed as somewhat ambivalent characters in the novels. By stubbornly protecting what they consider to be their employer's best interests, they repeatedly antagonize main characters whose perspectives are privileged in the text. In the following scene from Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, in which the loyal female servant Rachel functions as a blocking character in a romance plot, illustrates this kind of constellation. Gilbert Markham, one of the novel's protagonists and narrators, wants to be alone with Helen Graham, but Helen's servant Rachel interferes and makes Gilbert feel quite uncomfortable by means of her presence as well as by her quite openly hostile looks. Quote, "There was nothing for it but to turn around and desire the maid to light the fire. I owe Rachel a grudge to this day for the look she cast upon me ere she departed on her mission. The sour, suspicious, inquisitorial look that plainly demanded, 'What are you here for, I wonder?' Her mistress did not fail to notice it, and a shade of uneasiness darkened her brow. 'You must not stay long, Gilbert,' said she, when the door was closed upon us. 'I'm not going to,' said I, somewhat testily, though without a grain of anger in my heart against anyone but the meddling old woman. 'But, Helen, I've something to say to you before I go.' 'What is it?' 'No, not now. I don't know yet precisely what it is or how to say it,' replied I, with more truth than wisdom. And then, fearing lest she should turn me out of the house, I began talking about indifferent matters in order to gain time. Meanwhile, Rachel came in to kindle the fire, which was soon effected by thrusting a red-hot poker between the bars of the gate, where the fuel was already disposed for ignition. She honored me with another of her hard, inhospitable looks in departing, but, little moved thereby, I went on talking, and setting a chair for Mrs. Graham on one side of the hearse and one for myself on the other, I ventured to sit down, though half suspecting she would rather see me go. It's interesting that in this scene, there's quite a lot of attention paid to the interfering servant. In this novel, Rachel's antagonism eventually evaporates, but there are other examples where servants' grudges and biases have an even more significant impact on the plot. Perhaps the most famous example of a servant who clearly holds a grudge against some of her employers and who is obviously biased is Nelly Dean in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. An examination of Nelly Dean, whose narrative has also been categorized by several scholars as a prime example of unreliable narration, allows the conclusion that her biases are informed by her position as a servant and by her experiences of being treated as a servant. Servants who hold grudges and feel resentment become even more prominent in the sensation novels in the 1860s. Phoebe Marks in Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret is among the many intriguing servants in sensation novels. In contrast to earlier depictions of servants, Lady Audley's Secret offers readers a comparatively detailed description of what Phoebe Marks looks like, and the way she's introduced to the readers is apt to create curiosity. Quote, "The presence of a human being scarcely broke the silence, for the girl crept slowly over the thick grass, and gliding into the avenue by the side of the fish pond, disappeared under the rich shelter of the limes." By surrounding Phoebe with an air of mystery, the text suggests right from the start that she's a character who deserves the reader's interest. Her looks are later on described as follows, quote, "She was not perhaps positively a pretty girl, but her appearance was of that order which is commonly called interesting. Interesting it may be because in the pale face and the light grey eyes, the small features and compressed lips, there was something which hinted at a power of repression and self-control not common in a woman of 19 or 20. She might have been pretty, I think, but for the one fault in her small oval face. This fault was an absence of colour. Not one tinge of crimson flushed the waxen whiteness of her cheeks. Not one shadow of brown redeemed the pale insipidity of her eyebrows and eyelashes. Not one glimmer of gold or auburn relieved the dull flaxen of her hair. This detailed description of a servant is obviously a far cry from the curt references to servants typical of Austen's novels, which I showed you before. Phoebe's relationship with her employer, Lady Audley, then also turns out to be very interesting and very ambivalent. She's treated like a confidant and seems to like her employer to some extent, but she also eagerly seizes upon the opportunity of blackmailing her employer. The way Phoebe Marks is presented in the novel exemplifies a general tendency of sensation fiction, namely to make servants more visible, more individualized than in other subgenres of the Victorian novel, and to also spell out the grudges they have. Increasing visibility of servants makes their grievances more obvious and also draws the reader's attention to the social context in many cases. One of the reasons for this development is certainly the broader target readership of the genre. In contrast to many other genres, sensation fiction was not only read by the middle class, but also downstairs by the servants, who of course wanted to see themselves represented in the texts. So these are just some glimpses and also some developments which we see in the 19th century. So there's definitely a general tendency to make the servants more visible and also to make grievances, grudges, and the social context from which these might result more visible. If we look at how domestic service is remembered today, we can see that literary domestic servants in 19th century novels, like the ones I mentioned, continue to have an impact on the ways in which the history of domestic service is inscribed in the cultural memory. One source of images of domestic service in the 19th century are certainly audiovisual adaptations of 19th century novels like the ones I mentioned. For Jane Austen, for instance, you have many instances, similarly for Jane Eyre and many others, or novels by Dickens, of course. In these adaptations, servants are primarily shown to move around in the background. They're never missing. You always see servants while they're lighting fires, opening doors, or serving dinner. So servants are regularly seen, but for the most part, they're still not heard. They do not get a voice. Occasionally, however, adaptations also add scenes to make the interaction between employers and servants probably look a bit more modern, more friendly, more democratic perhaps. A case in point is a scene in the 1995 adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, showing Eleanor Dashwood, here played by Emma Thompson, packing farewell presents for the servants when she's about to leave Norland Park. It might come as no surprise after what I said before about servants in Austen's novels that this doesn't have any basis in the novel. So it's an addition to make the character more likable for today's viewers. In historical novels, there are also attempts to problematize the situation of domestic servants, sometimes by teasing out the implications of the friction that often can only be found in the margins in 19th century fiction. This can be seen most clearly in rewritings of specific 19th century literature. For instance, Joe Baker's Longbourn from 2013, which imagines life in the home of the Bennet family in Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of their servants. Moreover, there are revisionist historical novels, which, in general, as Ansgar Nünning pointed out a long time ago already, which pay attention to those voices that have traditionally been marginalized in historiography and fiction alike. And these also show a certain amount of interest in servants. The popularity of neo-Victorian fiction like Sarah Waters' Fingersmith has also drawn attention to the situation of servants in Britain in the 19th century, though admittedly there are other topics which are at the center. For many people today, to come back to the title of my talk today, images of domestic service in British history are presumably informed by television productions like Downton Abbey. Last week, the film Downton Abbey: A New Era opened in German cinemas, a movie that perhaps completes one of the internationally most successful British TV and film series of the 21st century. The series Downton Abbey, which was broadcast from 2010 to 2015, and the two movies derived from the series so far, have joined the large number of British films and television productions that package eras of British history into visually intense and often very attractive images. And attractive here, of course, is important. One of the premises of Downton Abbey is that the series strives to give as much attention to the lives of the domestic servants as to those of the upper-class families who own Downton Abbey. Whether this was really successful or not, I'm not sure. In recent years, quite a number of people wrote term papers and BA theses on Downton Abbey, and they always focused on the upper-class characters. So this might be material for an empirical study, perhaps. With its two-pronged structure, which sets it apart from the 19th century texts, obviously, Downton Abbey follows in the footsteps of another successful British TV series, which I also put on here, Upstairs, Downstairs, which was broadcast in the 1970s and which has essentially the same ideas. Both series have much in common. They're set in the first decades of the 20th century. Both include, for instance, references to the sinking of the Titanic. And they seek to create an impression of authenticity by means of a high degree of heteroreferentiality to realist details. So you find out a lot about what cleaning a house meant at this particular time, or how you serve dinner, things like that. In contrast to revisionist historical novels, these TV productions tend to privilege a view of domestic service that is clearly indebted to the literary tradition of the servant as loyal confidant. Moreover, for the most part, the series stressed the very good relations between upper-class families and their servants, so we definitely have a very nostalgic and also very conservative depiction of the past. Working in an upper-class household is shown to be a source of pride for the servants. While this is not necessarily the impression one gains from reading 19th century novels, Downton Abbey has certainly increased the overall interest in the history of domestic service and has contributed to efforts to learn more about the everyday life of domestic servants. This growing interest has also led to the publication of texts that were actually written by domestic servants in the 19th century in which they describe their lives. Texts that make it easier to understand the friction and antagonism that can be pinned down more or less explicitly in many novels from the 19th century. These texts serve as a reminder of the precarious situation of many servants and the young age at which many of them started to work. And I would like to illustrate this at the end of my talk briefly by means of two short excerpts from a text written by Marion Ashford, the daughter of a merchant born in 1787, who became an orphan in 1800 and therefore had to earn her own living from the age of 13 onwards. And she describes her first position as a servant as follows. I got a place at Hoxton, was the wife of the then head waiter of Garraway's coffee house. I remained in this place till I was near 16, my wages commencing at £2 10 shillings, rising £1 a year. My mistress here made me nurse the child and do everything that was laborious. But all that required any art or knowledge, she not only would not let me do, but would send me out of the way with the little boy while she did it herself. This was done that I should not leave her, or think myself qualified for a better place. In the winter, water used to come into the cellars, and I have been bolted in them for hours together, till I have been nearly exhausted with pumping and almost poisoned with the smell. However, I was well fed. The physically exhausting nature of the work, especially for a 13-year-old, is emphasized in this passage. Moreover, the account stresses that her employer makes it all but impossible for Marianne to acquire skills that would enable her to get a better position. Eventually, Marianne finds another position after all, but here she's confronted with new problems because now she's barely provided with enough food. I was very diligent in seeking a place, and I got one to go on the 3rd of December, with an old lady who lived in the city terrace in the city road. I set to work the next day to clean the house, which was very dirty with her being so long alone. This lady, who was very much in years, had been long a widow and was very kind to me in manner. But she was penurious in the extreme. My mistress had very high connections and used to spend her time very much among them. And she would be away for days and weeks together and leave me with very little to subsist on, and with orders to give Jacko, that's the lady's monkey, the best of everything. Accounts like these, of which there are more and more thanks to historians working on domestic servants, provide glimpses of what the life of actual servants in the 19th century could look like. And this shows very clearly the gap between what I call wishful thinking in many of the novels from the time and the actual circumstances. While circumstances in individual households, of course, differed quite a lot, at least wages tended to be very low in general, and servants' tasks in the household were physically very hard work. On the basis of texts like these, it seems justified to assume that the grudges and antagonism that often inform the relationship between servants and employers depicted in literary texts might be more than just a literary convention. So I think following this two-pronged approach, looking at literary texts but also looking at actual autobiographical documents we have from the time, allows us to see the 19th century novel and the class system depicted in it in a somewhat new light. Thank you very much for your attention.